Mr. Gonzalez from Texas.
Thank you, Chairman. And I want to associate my comments with my good friend Lou Carrera. Him and I took a trip to Central America. We went to Guatemala, we went to Honduras, and we went to El Salvador. And one of the I guess, surprising things is that I wasn't aware of is no members of Congress had visited that area in 3 years. So to the point, yes, there's a military aspect of it, but there's also a diplomatic. We'd like to see the State Department do more. But up here in Congress, in a bipartisan manner, we need to be doing more in our own backyard. And I know many of us on this committee are committed to doing this, to doing just that. My first question is for you, General. I just got back from a trip from Taiwan. It's the second trip to Taiwan in the past 14 months. I spent 20 years in the military, as my good friend August Pfluger pointed out, our chairman pointed out. I know what war looks like. We're at war. I mean, this is a war. Maybe a Cold War, but this is a war with China. With the People's Republic of China, every single day are invading Taiwan via their cyberspace. Not only that, but the question I have for you is, in particular, your expertise is in air. I spent 5 years as an air crewman flying against China. I know exactly when they come out and they intercept our aircrafts. They're doing that every single day, and there's a danger in that, right? Because everything is fine until there is an accident, a spark, if you will, that turns a Cold War into a hot war. Can you speak just to some of the dangers in which playing this game of chicken brings up, in particular to Taiwan?
Absolutely. China has demonstrated significant aggression in the air by penetrating Taiwanese airspace. And it is a violation of Taiwan's sovereignty. And also, when they're in the air, their professionalism is non-existent. They will, quote, dust us off, if you will. In one case, we had a collision, mid-air collision from one of their aircraft in a Navy P-3. And that is the nature of how they do business. And so what we can't do is watch them and let them get away with behavior like that and not do something back, and not be there with Taiwan, not be present, not be out there and make them respect us the way they are driving fear into the Taiwanese with their aggression.
Thank you for that. And my next question is for you, Ms. Bingen, is turning over to cyberspace. This is what war looks like. That's the first aspect of it. And in cyberspace, there are no boundaries. There are no borders. We're all in on this together. And you can't go it alone. You need to have allies. I put together a bill, the U.S.-Taiwan Advanced Research Act, that essentially creates a closer relationship in the cyberspace with our allies. Can you just speak to that as far as how can the United States grow our relationships with others that, let's say, are not traditional relationships? You know, yes, we have our Five Eyes and we've got those relationships that have had for a long time, but other places like Taiwan, what are your thoughts on growing that in particular in the cyberspace?
Well, Congressman, first, if I can go back to your Taiwan point, and thank you very much for visiting. I had the chance to go there in January as well. And on Taiwan, if I can say, the arming is incredibly important, giving them a greater defensive capability. It includes not just the tangible weapon systems, but the training that goes along with it. And I think there's much more capacity there for increased training opportunities with our forces. And the other point that you raised on Taiwan is every day they are in this cognitive disinformation war with China. And so that the more that with the CCP, so that the more that we can do to help them and highlight or create transparency around those disinformation campaigns is important. On the cyber front, you're absolutely right on the allies. These are areas, and this ties back into China's Belt Road Initiative. They are doing a lot to try to get their infrastructure and make others more dependent on them. Where that leads to is other country, not only their ability to surveil and steal data, but also they're advancing their techno-authoritarian norms and standards. So I think that there are things we can do on the international front, threat sharing, but also building norms much more akin to how we see the world and how we want the internet to be operated, data to be protected, than the Chinese model.
I think it's very clear to point out that the People's Republic of China are the aggressor. I spent 5 years in Iraq and Afghanistan. Chairman Pfluger has also been at war. I think it's safe to say we don't want war. We want to prevent a war. And part of that is showing that we're going to stand firm with our allies to prevent those. And thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Nevada, Ms. Titus.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Before I ask my specific question, I'd like to say that I agree, too, with Mr. Carrera, and it also was brought up by our last speaker that we need to do more. We don't do more by cutting the small foreign aid budget that we have in place now. We do more by investing more. You mentioned Belt and Road. China is investing all across Africa. They're building ports in Lima. They just bailed out Sri Lanka. That's what we're up against. And if we walk away, that's not going to be helpful in these difficult areas. But I want to ask you the question. We just heard this week about China saying that there's a potential conflict or confrontation if we don't put on the brakes. Now, I wonder just what that means for us. Is it an existential threat? Is it saber rattling? Is it nuclear war? What does that mean? How should we be gauging that? And what should we be doing in response besides shoring up Taiwan or, trying to make these investments that seem to be fairly difficult to get people to support? Anybody? Yeah.
Congresswoman, I'll start. I would say the narrative to the recent statement by the Chinese minister is a false narrative that we need to put on the brakes. We should start asking them to minimize their aggression, right? Not only here in the U.S., but with our allies and friends around the world. I think they're really great at putting us in the bucket as being the aggressors. And as we've heard from our distinguished congressmen and congresswomen, that's not the case, right? And I think we as the United States, diplomatically, have to do a better job, a more effective job of making sure the world knows that they are the aggressors. Because I think their narrative, and they have a great propaganda program, as we heard, and they will use that to show us as the aggressors.
General, would you how would you compare the threat by China to the threat internally, our homeland threat by domestic terrorists compared to China, if we're looking at where our priorities should be?
Well, ma'am, the threat to the United States from China is the most grave threat we have faced in our lifetime, certainly since the Cold War. And the reason why is we have an economic superpower that's stealing our technology, that's leaping ahead on weapons that can strike us right here in the homeland or deny our objectives overseas in defense of Taiwan. And if we let them continue at this pace and we don't answer that, we will find ourselves in a very uncomfortable position as Americans, which is watching U.S. service members lose fights. And so, to me, the existential threat posed by China and the CCP is absolutely the largest threat to the U.S., and we have to realize it. And they're approaching us any seam they can find, any way in. The balloon was a seam that they exploited. There's 100 other seams that's been discussed here. I think it's time that we wake up. It's a Sputnik moment for us here, and I think we need to realize that as an American society.
Just continuing with this down the panel, how about the CHIPS Act? We often hear that China's not the enemy, they're the competitor. Has this helped in any way to deal with the problem that we're now making chips at home instead of being so dependent on them economically?
One aspect on the CHIPS Act that I'd like to highlight is really the national security piece to it. When we look at, 80+% of the world's chips, including everything that we use from commercial to our weapon systems, are manufactured within the First Island chain. And we've talked also here about the military threat. We and the Taiwan Semiconductor Facility, we need to look at building greater resiliency in our industrial bases and our manufacturing capacities. And so that, for me, was a big benefit of the CHIPS Act.
Would you like to add to this conversation?
Sure. Thank you, Congresswoman. To go back to your original question about the pathways by which we would be most likely to see Chinese aggression, it is my view that the most likely avenue would be over a Taiwan scenario. If one thinks about how to deter that, there are two primary things in place that the United States has in our strategy. The first is a credible reassurance to Beijing that the status quo will not change, because if Beijing thinks that it is backed into a corner and has to choose either losing Taiwan or launching a very risky and even low probability win war, it's quite possible one can imagine them choosing the latter. So that credible reassurance portion is important. The other portion of deterrence, which relates to the CHIPS Act, is the change in the balance of power. So another way in which deterrence could fail is if over time shifts towards Beijing's favor in the probability that they would win a conflict would prompt them to act, even though the cost of the risk would be high. And that's why it's so important to ensure that the U.S. defense industrial base, through things like the CHIPS Act, is closely protected.
I can't see a clock. Is my time up? I can't. Oh, that's well. Just real quickly, is there anything specific we need to do next, like building off of the CHIPS Act, other than going on CODELs to Central America?
Congressman, if I may, just amplify the great comments here. I think on the CHIPS and Science Act, two things need to occur. More of that type of legislation that really partners our U.S. government legislative body funding with the U.S. corporate sector. Two, but the CHIPS and Science Act must be protected now. From ideation to development of new technologies, if we don't protect it, you're going to be having hearings in 5 years saying, how did all the technology from CHIPS and Science Act get stolen and in the hands of the Chinese? So two things can be true.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady's time has expired, and the chair now recognizes for the final question Mr. Crane.
General, this question is for you. A second ago, you were talking about how you were concerned about the age of the fleet. Is that correct? And then also you were talking about how China continues to steal our intellectual property. Is that correct as well? How do we stop that, General?
Well, the theft of intellectual property is something that probably goes beyond what I can comment on, but step one is realizing that it's happening and ensuring not only the prime contractors, but the subcontractors that develop our defense systems have the appropriate resiliency and hardening. The best way for us to counter China is to invest. You know, the investments the Department of Defense has made for the last 20 years to fight the wars we've been in are not necessarily the investments that are going to make us successful against dealing with a peer competitor like China. And so it's important that we transform our investment to the areas that most concerns them, which is our ability to hold targets at risk in their homeland and our ability to deny them their objectives vis-a-vis Taiwan. And so we can deter them through punishment, and we can also deter them through denial. And it happens by investment in the department in the domains that are most critical facing a peer competitor, air and space.
Thank you, General. My next question is for Mr. Evanina. A moment ago, you were raving about the capabilities and dominance of the U.S. intelligence agency. I think that, probably everybody up here would agree how impressive our intelligence agencies are and have been over the years. My question for you, sir, is are you aware of the lack of trust in our intelligence agencies by U.S. citizens?
Congressman, yes, I am, and it's a concerning issue.
Yeah. And you're aware that there is a select committee on the weaponization of the federal government up here right now?
Yes, sir, I'm aware of that.
I represent some amazing people in Arizona, rural Arizona. They love this country, one of the most patriotic districts in Arizona. I myself am a Navy SEAL. I joined the Navy after 9/11, and I served for 13 years, and I love this country. And I want our intelligence agencies to be strong. I think they need to be strong for good reason. But I'm going to tell you right now, sir, when we read years after the fact that 50 former national intelligence folks, several heads of the CIA claimed that the Hunter Biden laptop is Russian disinformation, only to find out years later what we all knew that it wasn't. That's alarming to a lot of Americans, and it makes us lose trust in our intelligence agencies. And for me, when I look at a guy like you that's done everything that you've done, as intelligent as you are, I know that's got to piss you off. If there were 50 former Navy SEALs out there lying to the American people, and I found out about it, that would piss me off because it undermines the community that I hold so dear. And I'm sure you probably have a very similar endearment to your community. Am I correct in assuming that?
You're correct, sir.
What do you think we do about that, sir? How do you think we regain the trust with the American people and our intelligence agency?
Congressman, I think you bring up a very valid point that not only reaches the current events of today with our intelligence and law enforcement community, but it also impacts the recruiting of future generations of women and men who want to serve in the U.S. government, intelligence, and military apparatus. And I think that is the core element. I think two things have to happen. Number one, there has to be complete transparency of things that happened in the past, but more importantly, of the great things that women and men are doing. We have to be more proactive in getting out to your district and other districts at the local level. And secondarily, there has to be some transparency of what's real and what's not real with the narrative reporting that we see in the media. And I think that's the obligation of law enforcement intelligence agencies to be forthwith of declassification and transparency of what's going on.
Real quick, Mr. Evanina, if it seemed like I was coming after you today, I apologize for that. It's nothing personal at all. I love this country, and I'm tired of losing faith and trust in the institutions and the organizations that as a little kid I had aspired to and I upheld. And I know I'm speaking for a lot of Americans when I say that, brother. Okay? Last question I have real quick is for Ms. Bingen. You said that war with China was not certain. Can you expound on that a little bit and please tell us all how we can, in your opinion, how we can avoid war with China? Thank you.
Absolutely, Congressman. I want to say that the cause isn't lost, and there are things that we as a nation can proactively do. So, for example, continuing to invest in a strong defense, ensuring our forces are ready, is a signal and a deterrent. Making sure that we invest in resilient networks, so that if the CCP decides to launch an attack, it will have a less effect on our networks and our infrastructure. Superior technology. Former Secretary of Defense I worked for would always say, we never want to send our sons and daughters into a fair fight. With the technology theft happening, we are very much at risk of sending our sons and daughters into a fair fight. So superior technology and agility in terms of how we use that technology. And then ensuring that we have a network of allies and partners. This is a weakness that the CCP has that we have. And sir, with all of your service, you know that we fight in coalitions, and it's important to make sure that our allies are with us and partners are with us and not with China.
Thank you. I yield back.
All right, so we have some logistical changes here. The chairman had to step out, so I'm going to ask unanimous consent for Ms. Jackson Lee to be recognized for 5 minutes.
We're in trouble now.
We're both freshmen, so
Yeah.
bear with us.
All right.
Unanimous consent for Ms. Jackson Lee to be
I recognize Ms. Jackson Lee.
Well, to both of the chairman and the ranking member, I'm very pleased to be able to join you. And from my perspective, you're two distinguished members of Congress, and thank you for your service. Thank you for your military service. Before I start, I think because we're in Homeland Security, allow me just to put on the record that to be able to compete with China, I think it is extremely important that we assert democratic values, our values, the strength of our values, our competitiveness, and maybe we will have an opportunity to get the answer to why, I believe it's public now, all of the personal data of so many Washingtonians, members of Congress, House and Senate have been breached. I don't believe that we have had any determination of who breached it, but we certainly want to be on top of those elements, be they commercial or be they a foreign country, from exposing private data of members of the House and Senate who have the responsibility of governing this nation. I wanted to put that on the committee's record because I'm incensed about it and hope that we will have some involvement ultimately in assessing that situation. But this is a very important hearing, and I want to begin by raising this question, and I'll have a second question, and I think, gentlemen, I will be finished. But I want to raise a question. Dr. Jose, you have described the evolution of the Chinese Communist Party's thinking when it comes to China's role around the world. We know that in recent years, the CCP has set its aims at developing China-centered and controlled global infrastructure, transportation, trade, and production networks. They tolerate no diversity when they go into countries. It is China, China, China. They don't even use the indigenous people. And China is competing with the United States in a global competition over government values. We have to win the world over by saying that our values of trade and otherwise are much better than theirs. And so, how successful are China's efforts? What actions can the federal government take to outcompete the Chinese Communist Party? Frankly, I think we're nicer, but I also think that if you interact with us, you'll have the benefits of investment in your own country, and you'll have the benefits of long-term recovery. Many of you know that we passed the CHIPS Act, CHIPS and Science Act, close to my heart as a former member of the Science Committee, which invests $280 billion to increase domestic semiconductor production. I'm excited about that. Some of that may even come to Texas. Unfortunately, not these gentlemen here, I don't think, that 90% of our friends on the other side of the aisle did not vote for it, but I know that they're probably working with it in their districts. So, Dr. Joseph, would you share that with me? And I'd love to have Ms. Bingham to answer that question as well. Dr. Joseph, would you please? And
Thank you, Congresswoman.
Looking at my...
These are really excellent questions, and I thank you for them. So you raised the issue of difference in government values, and I agree, although I should note that we do have some common interests, if not common values. China and the United States both want to see their populations live prosperous lives, for example, and both sides want to see the world address some of the challenges of global climate change. That being said, it is very true that the two countries have stark differences in the way they see the relationship between state and society. The protections that we have in the United States by which citizens enjoy civil liberties and can organize against the state in order to keep its power in check are simply not present there. And it is true that China indiscriminately or without considering the types of behaviors that the target regime or the target state is conducting, will invest in it. And you mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative. This is certainly one of the keystone portions of China's efforts. I do agree that the nature of the regime in that target country is quite important. We do have some research that suggests that economic statecraft that China uses, for example, is less effective when the target country is democratic. There's an intuitive logic there, of course, because if individuals, just like in the United States, can mobilize against their government if they are in collusion with the Chinese Communist Party for illicit gain, they can hold them accountable. And so I think that is it's a mechanism by which we can indirectly shape China's ability to use the Belt and Road in the way that you're describing.
Ms. Bingham?
Congressman, if I can add, you mentioned it exactly right. China has a playbook that they're using with the Belt and Road. We've seen it, the ports, 5G are examples, the ports where they go into countries. Djibouti is a great example where they go in, they operate the commercial port, they kick out the locals, they build up military infrastructure, and then it's a greater threat to the region and to our national security interests. So we see that happening across the globe. We as a government, I say formally, but the government needs to figure out how do they bring all their different tools of national power to the table to provide alternatives. Some of the areas we've been talking about today are on the technology front. I have a space background. I would offer as an example, our commercial space innovation sector right now is phenomenal. We are using our space technologies, our data in ways well beyond national security, understanding the climate, mapping, countering illegal fishing. This is soft power for Americans and for our companies. So ways that we can leverage some of these newer technologies while clearly protecting and ensuring that they don't fall into the hands of the CCP, but working with our allies and partners across the globe who want to work with us in these areas, figuring out ways to get that kind of information to them and opening up markets for our businesses so they're not just relying on the U.S. government is also important.
Let me thank you all so very much. I think it's been established that the Belt and Road technology or approach is a danger to the framework of democracy of this nation. We need to use that power of our values and, of course, of our technology. I like commercial space just because I'm a NASA aficionado and space exploration is crucial. And Dr. Joseph, thank you for that framework that we can utilize. This is an important hearing, and I thank you, gentlemen, for yielding, and I yield back to